All right, so today's discussion is going to be about Plato's apology. Right? First thing you should keep in mind is that the word apology comes from the word apologia, right? Which does not mean the same thing as saying I'm sorry. Rather, it is an act in apologetics, which means rather a justification of something or an explanation of something. So Socrates is here to explain why he has led his life in the fashion that he has. So while on the surface of things, of course, he is defending himself against charges. Okay? Beneath the surface, what he is defending is the urgency of self-examination. Okay? And like everything in Plato, it is all significant. Nothing is accidental. Even the slightest detail can give you insight into the larger teaching. Okay? And to demonstrate this for you, and really to lay the foundation for what I take to be the major teaching in the Apology, I want to draw your attention to the very beginning. Okay? So let's set the scene. Remember that we are in an Athenian courtroom. And in ancient Athens, which was a democracy, if you were a citizen, you voted on everything. So Socrates here is addressing 570-some people. And he has been brought up on two sets of charges. Okay? He is charged by those he calls the ancients. And what are their charges against him? Evildoer. He's an evildoer, okay? He's a charlatan. He makes the true appear to be false, and the false appear to be true. He is to be avoided. Okay. Now, of course, in confronting these ancient accusations, Socrates says he must grapple with shadows because the original accusers are no longer here. And he finds these ancient accusers to be more formidable than those present in the courtroom. Because when it comes to cross-examining his modern accusers, what he is struggling against is argument. He can show that if their arguments are untenable, then their charges are inadmissible. But when it comes to defeating these ancient charges, he is struggling against long-held opinions, ideas that were inculcated to the minds of his audience from the time they were children. And when we learn something at a young age, or have held a belief for a very long time, it is much more difficult for us to relinquish it. And of course, a modern explanation for that could be that we now know that for the first few years of our lives, the brain is still developing, still forming neural connections. And that to which it is that which provides stimulus creates connections. And the parts that are not stimulated die off. This is why it is so much easier for children to learn new languages than for adults, because it becomes hardwired in them, literally a part of who they are. So Socrates, at 70 years old here, is addressing people much younger than he is. and thus he knows his most formidable opponent is not any specific argument. Rather, it is human nature. It is the tendency of human beings to cling to that which they have long believed. Because our long-held beliefs, they form the tapestry of our self-identity, of who we are. And when somebody challenges those basic beliefs, they threaten our self-identity. That's why discussions about religion, discussions about politics and morality often become rather passionate quickly, because you're not just talking about academics. We're now talking about who we are and how we understand our place in the world and the meaning of our lives. So there are two sets of charges. As we've said, the ancients, who have charged him in general with being an evildoer, who makes the true appear false and the false appear true. Let me say a further word about that. We are all immediately familiar with the distinction between appearance and reality. We know that although things appear one way, in reality they may be very different. The desk appears to be a solid, impenetrable object, but if we gaze at it through an electron microscope, we see a mass of swirling particles with more empty space between them than there is matter. Okay? So, of course, as a metaphysician, as one who wants to understand what things are really like, our question would become, what is the desk really? Is it the one I see with the naked eye? Is it the one I see under the microscope? Or should I attempt to understand what it really means to be a desk in an alternative way altogether? Maybe the real meaning of the thing lies in its purpose. And so, the distinction between appearance and reality forms the basis of metaphysics. And this distinction is going to figure very prominently throughout the entire semester. Now, the second set of charges, issued by the so-called modern accusers, who are Omnisis and Miletus, are much more specific. What are the new charges? Good. He is charged with corrupting the youth, and
Are there new divinities?
yes. Let me just put this in the single word of idolatry. Right? And the text says, believing not in the gods of the state, but in other divinities. Okay? Divinities that dwell beneath the earth. Malevolent deities. Okay? And believing in false gods is what we call idolatry. All right. again, of these two classes, Socrates finds the ancients to be much more dangerous. Because here, he is struggling against not an argument or set of facts, but against human psychology. To defeat the ancient charges, he must persuade his audience to detach not just from a particular belief about Socrates, but to detach from part of themselves. Okay? So if we begin from the very start, I think that we can gain an insight into the central teaching of the whole dialogue. Now, Plato is a very gifted artisan, and what can easily be overlooked in a first reading can later show up as perhaps the real issue. Socrates says at the very beginning, and of course we join the action after the prosecution has arrested. He says, "How you have felt, O men of Athens, at hearing the speeches of my accusers, I cannot tell. But I, for one, found them so convincing that I nearly forgot who I was. Such was the effect of their speeches, even though they have hardly spoken a word of truth." Okay? Something to that effect. So I want to ask you, first of all, what does Socrates mean by saying, I nearly forgot who I was?
That they had twisted the truth so much to the point to where it wasn't that they were talking about him, just some made up version of him.
Good, yeah. That they were so persuasive, so skilled in the art of rhetoric, that Socrates can understand if his audience at that moment is thinking he's guilty. Because they were so good that I almost believed them. Now, of course, Socrates here is speaking tongue-in-cheek. This is facetious. He's exaggerating. But he's drawing our attention again to the fact that there is an important difference between what is really the truth and what appears to be the truth, and the power of words to forge a false appearance of the truth. Okay? Now, of course, Socrates doesn't for a minute actually believe that he is guilty, but he is identifying with his audience. Okay? He is acknowledging the power of persuasion that his accusers possess. But now let's go a level deeper. And let me ask you, in what other sense might we take the idea of forgetting oneself? How can I forget who I am?
If someone makes you really angry.
Yes, that's a great example. When I am swept away by emotion, if I'm angered, or afraid, or hurt, I may say or do things which later I regret. And when I calm down, I may call you and say, look, I'm really sorry. That person you saw yesterday wasn't me. That's not who I really am. So in some sense, for a moment I became alienated from my better self, or my true self. It's as if I forgot who I was. I was behaving in a way that misrepresents who I really am or who I think I ought to be. I'd like to suggest to you that this theme of self-forgetting is really the issue running throughout the entire apology and beyond. Because ultimately, Socrates' explanation for living the way he has, which is to question others, to help others to recognize their ignorance, is in the service of helping us to remember who we are. That in some sense, all of us have a tendency to forget our true nature, to forget who we really are. And when we do that, we mistake false goods for what is really good. Let me illustrate this to you. If I judge this to be a good piece of chalk, what makes that possible? What do I compare it to?
Your experience with other chalk pieces?
Sure, yes. It's because I know what a chalk is supposed to do. I know the purpose it is intended to serve. So that when it serves its purpose, it's a good piece of chalk. But if I were to say, hey, this piece of chalk isn't telling me what time it is, I would be, and therefore I call it a bad piece of chalk, I would be misevaluating it because I have misinterpreted what its real nature is. It isn't its nature to tell the time. The nature of the chalk is to write. Okay? So likewise, I think Socrates is suggesting that one manifestation of forgetting who we really are is that we misevaluate how well we are living our lives. And when I spend my time and energy in the pursuit of monetary wealth, power over other people, and reputation or prestige, these false goods taken for true is just a manifestation of mistaking who I actually am. I have forgotten who I am. Now let me support this interpretation by pointing out something. That Socrates always teaches, although he denies ever having been anybody's teacher, which is kind of ironic, by asking questions. Okay? And the technique of asking questions as a heuristic device, as a method for teaching, is called the elenchus. Which is commonly just referred to as the Socratic method. Okay? Socrates will ask a question which is intended to evoke a response which will lead to further inquiry. And if we find that the response leads to a contradiction, then his respondent is forced to modify his answer. And as this discussion moves back and forth, the idea is we can refine our understanding of the concept at issue. And typically, Socrates was interested in ideas like the meaning of courage, or justice, or temperance, or beauty, or truth. Okay? But when Socrates asks us questions, this method is based on the idea that in some manner we already know. We already have some sense of the truth, but we've forgotten that when we come into this world, we suffer a sort of amnesia. Okay? And it was Plato's idea that the soul pre-exists the body, and at birth they are fused. Okay? And it's because the soul is fused to a body, or incarnated, that we are so prone to make mistakes, because we get seduced by our senses, which we know are deceiving. And my body, of course, is needy. Okay? It takes time to learn to sit with a book for any period of time without having to succumb to your stomach telling you that you need to have a snack, or you need to take a nap, or need to watch a television show or something. Okay? And this doctrine that learning is remembering something that we already know but have forgotten is called the doctrine of Amnesis. Now, if you just look at this word amnesis, what English word does it suggest? Amnesia, right? Forgetting. And the prefix on means something like not. So not forgetting, or unforgetting. In a word, remembering, or recollecting. So Plato's doctrine of anamnesis is a theory of education and learning, which suggests that to learn is not to acquire brand new information. Rather, it is to recollect, to recollect the pieces of the puzzle that have been fragmented when we became incarnated. Learning is remembering. And it's really fascinating, it's interesting, because we do seem to have a certain sense of things. You know, like our conscience, your moral conscience. before we ever study something like ethics, we have a kind of moral awareness when your conscience bothers you, but you're not really sure why. This is suggestive that we already have some bearings regarding how we ought to live. Yet, we can't quite pinpoint it. Okay. So going back to the idea of forgetting, when Socrates says that I nearly forgot who I was, I think that he is prefiguring or anticipating the real problem that he's up against. It isn't a set of charges. It is the tendency of human beings to be forgetful, to forget that we are cut out for something much greater than the paltry pursuit of wealth and control. And by the end of the dialogue, of course, Socrates is explicit in telling us that he has spent his entire life urging that we shouldn't spend our time and energy in pursuit of worldly goods, but rather always to seek the greatest improvement of the soul. And I don't want you to be, turned off by the term soul, because for the Greeks there was no distinction between soul and mind. These are equally good translations of the Greek word nous. What we're talking about here is who you are, yourself, okay? Your character. And Socrates wants us to realize that no matter how much worldly wealth one accumulates, it can never purchase virtue. You cannot buy courage. You cannot buy justice. No matter how much control or power you have over others, it cannot give you power over yourself. But rather, if we seek first to become virtuous, if we learn what it really means to be courageous and just and temperate and pious, then these other things will naturally follow. And I think what he probably means by that isn't that if I become a good person, suddenly I'm going to be rich or powerful, but that when I learn what it really means to be virtuous, I will realize that that other stuff was never what I really wanted in the first place. It'll show up for what it really is, a poor kind of wealth, a substitute, a poor substitute for what truly enriches a person. Okay. All right. So you see, I haven't gotten past the first sentence. Okay? We could spend an entire semester just on this one work, easily. But let's make some progress. Socrates says that it makes sense to address these charges in the order they were issued. Okay? So, he says, you must be wondering, if I'm innocent, why did I get this reputation, this enduring reputation for being an evildoer? And so he tells a story. The story of when his friend, Caraphon, made a visit to the oracle at Delphi. Okay. Can anybody tell me what happens there?
Oracle says he's the wisest man. And
Yeah.
he decides to go around and see if he really is.
Good. Okay. Let's make just a very small amendment. The oracle says there is nobody wiser than Socrates. Okay? And why Caraphon thought of asking this question, who knows? You know, Caraphon, like Socrates' other friends, were very fond of him. They adored him. And Caraphon, I suppose, just wanted to know if he could boast that his friend was among the wisest people there were. So when Caraphon tells Socrates that the oracle, which is supposed to be a prophet, right, the voice of a god, that there is nobody wiser than Socrates, does Socrates believe it?
No.
In fact, he is troubled. He's completely flabbergasted by this news. Because in his mind, he doesn't know anything. Okay? Again, an example of Socratic irony. Okay? Socrates not only claimed that he was never anybody's teacher, he also claims that he doesn't know anything. Okay? Now, what he means by that is that Socrates never developed a specialized skill set. And the Greeks called such a thing a techne. And what word probably arose from this? All that. Technology, technique, technical, okay? And it suggests a specialized know-how, a trade, okay? And indeed, Socrates never learned one, okay? Socrates wasn't a carpenter or a cobbler. He wasn't a poet, all right? And he was well aware that many people did possess these skills. And in that sense, they had knowledge that Socrates did not. So as you say, Socrates decided to pay a visit to these groups of people with the reputation for knowledge in order to show that the oracle is mistaken.
But wasn't he the favorite student of philosopher Archimedes?
Perhaps.
And so would he have knowledge, at least of some sort, since...
He's got knowledge of some sort, and the question is, what? What is it that I know that makes me special? Okay? Because, of course, Socrates always urged us to know ourselves. That the most important thing we could do is seek to know ourselves so that we could pursue a genuinely good life and not deceive ourselves about who we are. Okay, not tell ourselves that everything's all right, that I'm doing it just the way I ought to. And then find out someday that, hey, I sort of missed the boat because I was too proud to consider that I was wrong. Okay? So he visits these groups of people. He goes to the poet, he goes to the craftsman, and he visits the rhetoricians, the politicians. And in each case, he discovers the same thing. While they did have knowledge of a certain variety, the shipbuilder could build a great ship. The poet could write a great poem. But when they were really questioned, they thought they knew more than they actually did. The poet didn't understand his own poetry. Rather, he had some sort of seemingly divinely dispensed gift for poetry, but couldn't really interpret it. The rhetorician could make a pretty speech, but when questioned, it was revealed that this speech was full of contradictions. And although the craftsman could put together a worthy ship or build a good house, that didn't mean that they knew how best to use these things or what their real value was. So now Socrates understands. He says, look, you certainly may know something that I don't know. But when it comes to understanding what is ultimately good and beautiful and virtuous, neither one of us possesses knowledge. The difference between us is that I know that I don't have that knowledge, whereas you think that you do. And so wisdom is not knowledge. Wisdom means rather knowing that you don't know. To be wise is to have the courage to admit your own ignorance. Because if I think I've already got everything figured out, I can't even raise a question. What's the point? If I already know something, there are no questions to be asked. So Socrates has solved the riddle. But more so, he takes this pronouncement as a mission. Socrates now believes that it is his God-given mission to question others and to help them to realize their limitations, to wake them up. Because in a sense, Socrates thinks we are all sleepwalking. Because when I'm asleep, if I'm dreaming, I think what I'm dreaming is real, when it is only an appearance. And this is the way Socrates thinks most of us go through life, mistaking appearance for reality, pursuing false goods rather than the real thing. Which is itself a form of idolatry. No matter what you make your God, and plenty of people make money their God, or power their God, or a drug. That is true idolatry, the very thing that Socrates is being charged with. So it's as if this entire trial is itself a symptom of the illness of believing that we know things when we don't. Pride, a sort of intellectual pride. Okay. Now I should say something about the modern charges, okay? And the fact that Socrates so handily dismisses them, I think indicates to us that these are not the real issue here, okay? He is charged with corrupting the youth. And I find this actually rather humorous, because of course, in ancient Greece, pederasty was perfectly acceptable, which was sexual relationships between adult men and boys. Okay? But that's not what they mean by corrupting the youth. Okay? They mean encouraging the youth to think for themselves and not just believe everything they were told. Okay? So what Socrates asks of his prosecutor is simply, do you think that anybody would intentionally harm themselves? Now, Omnisis says no. Nobody would intentionally hurt themselves. And you and I know that, of course, we do things all the time we know to be self-destructive. So what I would say is that even though I might be doing something right now that is destructive to myself, whether I'm, drinking too much or cutting myself or being promiscuous or whatever it is, at the moment I'm doing it, I think it's what I need. It's making me feel better. But nobody wills, in the long run, to do themselves harm. Okay? And then he asks whether they realize that Socrates lives with these people. It's not like he's a traveling teacher who goes to a city, takes a wage, and leaves. Socrates never took any money from anybody for teaching. Socrates lives amongst these people, these young people whom he teaches. And the prosecution agrees to that, enthusiastically. Because that's what makes it all the more ruinous that he's constantly with them. And then he asks this final question. Wouldn't you agree that the people you surround yourself with have an impact on you? When you hang out with a group of people for long enough, doesn't it rub off on you? Don't you become like the people that you associate with?
Not really.
Really? So why do we tell our children to hang out with the good kids and not the bad
It
ones?
depends. Everybody is their own individual. So you're going to do what you want to do regardless, no matter who you hang out with. So it just depends on yourself.
Well, experience,
I think
being
perhaps
a teacher.
you need to think back to high school and grammar school and how important it is to fit in and to do what the group is doing. But, I mean, I'm not dismissing what you're saying. Of course, it is possible to be your own person and to make your own decisions. But if that were the case, and the people that you were associating with were behaving in ways that you found to be distasteful, you would no longer associate with them, right? So, I mean, basically Socrates is saying, if he was intentionally corrupting the youth, then why would he also spend his free time with them? So the argument is this. You've said that nobody intentionally does themselves harm. Yet, I intentionally corrupt the youth and spend my time with them. It would follow that I intentionally corrupt myself, which you've already admitted nobody would do. So either, if I do corrupt them, I certainly don't do it intentionally, which means I am not guilty of willful criminality, or I do not corrupt them at all. Okay? Now, the relative merits or demerits of that particular argument, I don't think is really what the issue of dialogue is. Okay? As far as the idolatry charge, that one is much simpler. Socrates asks Omnisis whether he's saying that Socrates simply believes in different gods than he does, or whether Socrates is a complete atheist. And what do they say? He's an atheist, right? I mean, they are zealous. They want to make Socrates out to look as bad as they can. You don't believe in anything, Socrates. Well, then he's got him. Because a moment ago you said, I believe in different gods. How can I believe in different gods and not believe in gods at the same time? Okay. So he's shown that that charge is contradictory. So the jury is dismissed, and they come back, and as we know, they find him guilty. But by a significantly small margin. It is 50 votes, more or less, out of 570 or so, by which he is found guilty. So he impressively did bring a number of people back over to his side, okay? But it was also the practice in the Athenian system that if you were found guilty, you were given the opportunity to suggest your own punishment. What do you think we should do with you, Socrates? Socrates says, for devoting my whole life to trying to make you better, you should give me free room and board for the rest of my life. Okay? And they don't find that funny at all. So they sentence him to death. And as we know, he dies by the ingestion of hemlock poison.
Is that in there? I didn't get
That appears in the Creto, which is often sold as an anthology. You get the Apology, the Credo, and the Phaedo, which are three dialogues which deal with the trial, the aftermath, and the death of Socrates. But then Socrates addresses what has happened here, all right? And he says, "So you found me guilty, and soon I'll be dead. But I tell you that you might kill my body, but you cannot harm me. And that by doing so, you're going to be harming yourselves much more. Because although you take my life, you cannot harm my soul. You cannot take away my virtue. Yet by putting an innocent man to death, you certainly will be harming yourself. And you are not likely to find another Socrates, someone who is willing to forego the kinds of things that most people covet, like a nice home and nice clothing and so forth, in order to help you find virtue. But let's suppose that you were to say to me, Socrates, just this once, we will disregard the prosecution. And as long as you promise not to practice philosophy publicly like this any longer, we'll let you go. I would still have to refuse you. And that I will never cease the practice of philosophy. Not even if I have to die many times. Now again, we hear that and we understand that Socrates is just really exaggerating to make his point. Because you can't die more than once unless you happen to believe in reincarnation, right? So kill me as many times as you want. I'm not going to quit what I believe in. But now let me ask you again, to go a little bit deeper. What do you think it might mean to die many times?
Put away your old life.
Yeah, that's very well said. When you discover that some belief or practice that you have had for a long time is no longer viable, or that the job you've been doing you just can't do anymore, or the person you've been with you can't be with anymore. It's like letting part of yourself die. You've got to let go. And that is difficult to do. Even when the thing let go is painful, we cling to what is familiar, even if it's harmful to us. And elsewhere, Socrates actually says, to do philosophy is to practice dying. Because again, Plato believed that when you're born, soul and body are put together. And at death, the soul is released. So when we practice philosophy, since we are attempting to separate the mind from the body, to reason without being influenced by what our senses tell us, it is like practicing dying. becoming willing to let go, to detach from long-held ways of thinking and being. Is the sickness for which philosophy is the remedy. Socrates, in fact, often thought of himself as a physician, but not of the body, a physician of the soul. And of course, it's also here near the end of the dialogue where Socrates issues these gems, like the idea that the unexamined life is not even worth living. No matter how well you may live, if you haven't taken time to examine your conscience, to question whether you have found genuine virtue, then you've missed something essential about being a person. And perhaps what he means is that part of what we are is to be questioners, whether or not we ever find true answers. Finding the ability, the humility, to say, I really don't know, but I'm going to do my best to improve, to find out, is part of what it means to become fully human.